Captain's Log, July 25th, 2015. Today on the Captain's Log, I'd like to give my informal and off-the-cuff thoughts on the X-Men Days of Future Past Rogue Cut, which just came out last week, and I've been really excited to see some of these scenes put back in the movie, and I just got a chance to watch this yesterday, so I'm going to talk about a little bit here. I thought it was so cool that Bryan Singer and his team released this cut, and that Fox allowed this, and that instead of having to just see this in deleted scenes like with Amazing Spider-Man 2, which, by the way, side note, I haven't had a chance to watch those yet. I haven't seen those scenes, so maybe eventually I'll do a video about that too. Folks have asked me about it. I haven't had a chance to watch that yet, but anyway, I think it's really cool that we get to see the full movie with all those scenes put back in. Superhero movies, and of course, a lot of Hollywood movies in general, kind of notorious for scenes getting cut that really maybe should have been in the movie. That sometimes scenes get cut for really good reasons, of course, and I think that there are some things in here that were cut for really good reasons, and but then sometimes, you'll get kind of incomplete pieces and stuff like that. It's really neat that when there are scenes that maybe should have stayed in the movie, or at the very least inform certain character things, and it's nice to get to see them again, or to get to see them, that you get a full cut and you get to watch what that movie would have been, regardless of whether or not it technically counts as canon. And the X-Men movies have had this in spades. You go back to the first X-Men movie, and there are a couple scenes there, especially an extended scene with Scott and Jean and Wolverine with some of that love triangle stuff, where I found myself really kind of bewildered by the fact that that scene wasn't left intact the way it was, and really wish that there was a way that I could watch the whole thing all together. And I forget, there was like an X-Men 1.5 DVD that was put out, and I can't remember if that was those scenes put back in, or if it just had more special features on it. It's been a while since I've looked at that. I don't remember. I have that. I just haven't watched it in years. So anyway, this is kind of a dream come true for folks that, first of all, really like Anna Paquin and thought she got shafted and thought it was kind of sad that that she wasn't in the movie, but also just for a thing that you hear all these things about cool things that got cut, or at least interesting things that got cut, and you go, oh, well, could we at least get to see a cut with all of it put back in? So the question is this experience like Superman 2, the Donner cut, or like the Daredevil director's cut? And, those are movies that a lot of people feel like should have been left more or less intact the way that they are in those director's cuts. And I would say that with this, not necessarily. Of course, I loved the movie from the beginning and thought that maybe when I watched this, it might hurt that cut quite a bit, and I'd go, oh, well, you put this stuff in and it's so much better that I felt, that I feel ignorant loving the original. Did not have that experience. This was a very interesting watch, and there's a lot of things I love about adding the Rogue stuff back in and fleshing out the future stuff, and I really appreciated that about it, where it feels a lot more like X4 and X-Men First Class 2 than the other, which feels a lot more like, First Class 2, and then is kind of a tribute to that other stuff, and there's kind of and then you get kind of that cool reunion at the end. So I'm going to spoil a lot of stuff with this. So if you haven't seen the Rogue Cut and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch the rest of this video. I guess for those folks, I'll just say real quick that of whether or not it's worth your money. It's not a really different movie. It's not like there are major plot points changed, like with the Daredevil director's cut or anything like that. Like there's anything that's taken out and then changed or altered or contrary to what was in that original cut. Basically, what's put back in is is just as the title would suggest. There's a minor, I don't want to say minor, but a short subplot kind of that involves Rogue and makes the future stuff a little bit more prominent than it was before, and there's a little bit of extension of scenes in the future stuff at the beginning, and then there's a couple of added things in the past that I probably shouldn't give away for those folks if you want to watch it and get to experiencing that stuff for the first time yourself. I'll say that if you love this movie and you're really curious, it's probably worth it, if for nothing else, for the special features in the second disc, which I haven't had a chance to watch yet, but I think it's really cool that this release since we didn't get the Rogue cut at the very beginning, Bryan Singer and his team and Fox decided to put the theatrical cut as well as the Rogue cut on this, so that if you haven't bought it yet and you've been waiting for this, you don't have to buy it twice. Thanks, Fox. I mean, that's really cool, and it's worth enough bang for your buck if you already bought it the first time, so that you could enjoy it for, like, because it's been what, almost a year now since this came out. You get to, I mean, since it came out on DVD and Blu-ray, you have reason to buy it again, and that it's not just for a cut that's maybe, what, 15, 20 minutes long? I don't even think it's quite that much longer. So that's really cool. There's reason for every fan of this movie to buy this if you're so inclined. And I think they did a great job with the release. So I'm going to highly recommend this, especially for people who really liked that movie, regardless of the fact that of the theatrical, regardless of the fact that, the theatrical cut holds up just fine, and it does not feel like an incomplete piece having watched this, with the exception of one scene, which I'll get to here in a minute with spoiler stuff. Okay, so that's my recommendation for folks that don't want to know anymore. You can turn this off now. This concludes today's Captain's Log. Thanks for watching. Now, for folks that want to know more stuff, or for folks that maybe don't plan on watching this and are curious, or for people who have already watched it, here's what I thought of some of the nitty-gritty. So as I was saying with the future stuff with the Rogue thing, what I really like about that is that it broadens that scope, and the big thing is that we get to go to the X Mansion in the future. That's one thing that I kind of hate losing from the theatrical cut. What you get now is this parallel between these two, what feel like very different places that are that are physically standing in the same place, but in time are in different are in different places, or in different times, and neither of them is what that place was intended to be. Professor Xavier's dream is not realized. It's in shambles. The mutants are in trouble, and bigotry is winning the day. So when you look at what's going on in 1973, Professor Xavier has given up, and when you look at the future, I guess 2023, Professor Xavier has lost. And it's really cool getting to parallel those, where you've got the mansion in the past that is no longer a school, and the mansion in the future that has been taken over by the Sentinels, and they're operating there, and they've got scientists that are doing experiments on mutants and stuff. That is a thing that I love having back in this movie, and that I kind of wish somehow or rather could have stayed in the theatrical cut, because that is one big thing that I think adds a lot to this, because you're seeing Professor Xavier's dream not only not realized, but perverted, and I think that's really, really neat. There's also this fantastic transition at one point where you get to see the X-Mansion in the past transitioning into the X-Mansion in the future, and we're waiting to win the day so that that future can be changed, and so that when we get into what will become our new present, which is in the past, which is loopy, the X-Mansion can become what it was meant to be in the first place, this safe haven for mutants, in this place where mutants can learn how to control their powers and help Professor Xavier realize his dream of human and mutant equality. And I love that a lot. I think that's absolutely fantastic. What about the Rogue stuff? Well, it makes the bit with Kitty Pryde getting stabbed make a little more sense, because in the theatrical cut, she kind of gets stabbed, and I always thought that it kind of just feels like, okay, we got to create some tension in the future so that our future people are dealing with some difficulty, and it's not easy for them, and you're constantly waiting for the Sentinels to break in, and so there's all this suspense of what happens if the Sentinels break in and they break Kitty Pryde's link with the past, and then Wolverine can't help out back then anymore. And it serves that purpose okay in the theatrical cut, but Kitty Pryde is just kind of sitting there in horrible, excruciating pain and still managing to get through, which I guess, it makes her sympathetic and very heroic that she's continuing to go through all that. But it did always kind of feel like something was sort of missing. And of course, the thing that's missing is, in this version, the idea is that she's not going to be able to hold out. She just physically can't hold out with that stab wound, and they can't really treat her her in the position she's in. There's just not anything anybody can do, so they gotta go get Rogue. But Rogue is in the X-Mansion being experimented on, and so Bobby and Magneto and some folks have to go try to rescue her so that she can step in, so that she can take Kitty Pryde's powers and take over. First, let me say what's really cool about it. What's cool about it is, like I said earlier, it helps make it feel more like X4, because you had that love triangle, which I never liked, but you had that sort of pseudo love triangle with Bobby and Kitty Pryde and Rogue, and they're kind of they're kind of calling back to that. I didn't get any sense in the first movie, of course, that, or the first version rather, that it's not a sequel, that Kitty Pryde and Bobby are dating. And in this version, it's very clear that they're dating, and you know, Rogue was captured by the Sentinels. Of course, you have to just assume that she got her powers back after X3, like Magneto did, that just everybody's powers came back, and we're not talking about that. Of course, this cut does nothing to explain anything more than the theatrical cut did or didn't, with, like, how did Professor X get his body back, or why does he look like he's in his old body, and that kind of stuff. That's still all glossed over, and I'm not going to sit here and just review the whole movie, but just in case you're wondering and you haven't seen this, it doesn't really do anything to fix any of that stuff. But anyway, so you have the love triangle thing in X3. It's subtly brought back, but it's not about the love triangle, and Bobby ends up giving his life in a giant epic sacrifice for Rogue so that she can save the past. And I think that's really cool that he gets to be with Kitty Pryde, who he seemed, you know, he obviously liked both girls and was with Rogue, but then, you know, questioned her and because of, you know, her decision to leave and all of that. So, but anyway, it's kind of cool that, you know, he got to be with Kitty Pryde and sort of be happy, but then ultimately sacrificed his life for Rogue, who was his first love in the first place, and like, he, you know, obviously cares about Rogue, but it's also to save the past, and it's also, you know, to save Kitty Pryde too. So you know, I like all of that. I think it's fine. It's still somewhat hurried, and then of course there's the whole thing of they're trying to create a future that isn't that way anyway, and then when you see the end of the whole thing, where we've changed the future, Bobby and Rogue are together anyway. But I think it's cool. But I do like the epic sacrifice. It made me think of something I'd never thought of before, which is, I wish Rogue had been used in this movie in a very different way. The more I've thought about it, and I'd love to know people's opinions on this, because I don't know. I don't know if I'm right about it, but I think this is maybe a neat idea, and I'm surprised they didn't go with this. And I'm not trying to rewrite the movie. I always say that, but the thing is, using Mystique's blood to give all of the future Sentinels the ability to manifest all these different mutant powers never really made sense to me, because she doesn't have the ability to absorb powers. She has the ability to shapeshift. We could have made that Rogue. And of course it would have been a very different movie as far as, you know, how the Sentinels get made, because they're using Mystique, but like, we could have still more or less told the same story and still had this idea that in the future they've added Rogue, and maybe that's why they kidnapped her in the first place, and they're doing experiments on her, and it would have bookended the franchise as it is right now in a really cool way, because, you know, this whole thing is kind of a reunion for Bryan Singer and his X-Men from the very beginning, and of course, you know, we're going to move on from this, but this is like a soft reboot thing. So wouldn't it have been really neat, the more I thought about it, if we bookended it with the more or less the same plot that Magneto used in the first movie, in using Rogue to make all the humans into mutants, reversed, with the humans creating these cybernetic organic crossbreeds that use Rogue in a similar way to destroy all mutants and just have humans. And, you know, that would be like a really perverse thing, and it also would just make more sense, because that's what her power is. She absorbs, you know, mutant powers. I would never have thought that if there hadn't been a Rogue cut. So, what we have is cool, but I don't really understand how the Sentinel thing works, and I just thought of that and thought that might have been neat. Other things that are put back in this besides the Rogue stuff, you've got an extended scene toward the beginning that I really wish had been left in. This is the big thing for me that forget all the Rogue stuff really should have been there, and that is, there's a couple extra minutes with the heavy exposition scene, and I'm sure it was cut because, oh, this is a heavy exposition scene and it keeps going and we keep explaining things, and that's got to cut off at some point. The problem is it cuts off at just the point that it gets really smart about it. Because you've got Bishop, who, by the way, this scene should have been left extended for no other reason than Bishop's got a really cool accent. I wish he got more dialogue and got to talk more. And because that scene explains that Bishop actually has his own set of mutants, and that's why there's all these extra mutants that we haven't seen before that have come together with the X-Men. He's got his own team, and since Bishop's always from the future, I thought that was kind of neat that he's got his own team along with the X-Men, and that's not in the original cut at all. Not that there's a whole lot of character stuff for him or anything like that, but that mention I think was kind of cool and would have been nice to stay in. But the big reason I wish to stay in it is because Bishop starts asking questions, and so often when I see time travel stuff where there's a terrible future and it's just a foregone conclusion that we need to change it, people don't act like people all of a sudden. If everything is falling apart and there might not be any future for humanity, then it makes sense to sacrifice your future. And that's the argument that is presented by Professor X and everybody on the other side to Bishop when he asks those questions. But yay that he asked the questions. He says a couple things. The first thing he says is, how do we know, like I said, that the future is going to be any better when Wolverine goes back in time and changes it than it is right now? Like, how do we know? It could be worse if we start monkeying around like that, which also is great that that's in there, because that speaks to what Beast says later, or earlier, depending on how you look at it, later linearly in the film, when he's talking about the quantum physics theory that you can't really change anything, time is a river, and he's saying, how do we know that that's going to be any better? And secondly, he says, how do I know that we will be any kind of a part of it? Which I think is kind of a fun nod to where some of these characters came from in the comics, and the fact that they're part of this future that we're trying to change, and that Bishop and Cable both have always been characters that are from this dystopian future. Do they even exist without it, or do they exist in anything like the same form? So we're kind of commenting a little bit on the source material with that, and I think that's really cool. If we could have kept nothing else, I wish that was back in the movie. That's the big one for me. The other thing, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this, is the Beast and Mystique scene. I'm really torn of two minds about it. On the one hand, it helps once again, it helps it to feel more like First Class 2 on top of the X4 thing, where we're tying up loose ends, and it was always kind of weird that they didn't get a scene together. So I like it for that, and I like that Beast is conflicted, and that we see more of his kind of conflicted nature, where he loves Mystique for who she is, but he can't accept what he is, and it's kind of the same thing. I always really liked that relationship, and I always thought that was an inspired idea that I never would have thought of. But I'm not sure about it, because I feel like even as much as he cares about her, he would be a little bit smarter than to let her in the house and to have that romantic moment with her, because obviously she comes in and kind of takes advantage of him. And I don't think it makes her necessarily any less sympathetic that she takes advantage of him like that, because she's kind of more far gone, and you've got some cool identity stuff with her of, is she Charles's Raven, or is she Magneto's Mystique? And at the end of the movie, she becomes kind of something else entirely, and not what she would have been if the future had taken its course the way it was going to, and then when you add in she's pretending to be Stryker and takes Wolverine and is going to change entirely what Weapon X is, or if there is anything like Weapon X, it's kind of the uncertainty of that future is kind of exciting, and seeing where she's going. So I'm okay with the fact that she takes advantage of him. I just don't know that he would be. I just feel like he would be a little bit smarter than that, and there's kind of this moment where he looks at Professor X and he's kind of like, "Whoops, she took advantage of me," and that's kind of all the discussion we have about it after that. I just feel like he made this big giant mistake, and it's kind of surprising that he's not berated a little bit more for it by his colleagues. But then they're in a hurry and things are moving fast, and so I guess it's okay. But I do kind of see why they took it out, because I think that it messes with the momentum, the pacing of where we're headed, and it does kind of throw Beast under the bus a little bit, maybe. But like I said, I'm a little bit torn. I'm not sure exactly how I feel about it. All in all, I think it's a great cut, but I also think the theatrical cut also remains really good, and I don't feel like, for the most part, I'm missing too much by taking this stuff out. The big thing that would have really served the theatrical cut in putting the Rogue stuff back in is just that paralleling of what Xavier's mansion is and what it means. But I don't know that we really needed, beyond that, the Rogue stuff, because, and I meant to say this earlier, excuse me, because, and this is kind of my big criticism of it, if it had happened earlier in the movie, the X-Men in the future would have felt like they mattered more to the overarching plot and that they were accomplishing more. Now, they have no idea what's going on in the past, so naturally they would want to do this, because they wouldn't know how important Wolverine is at each step of the way in the past. But it is kind of weird. It kind of deflates the tension a little bit, I think, just structurally. It doesn't do anything to characters at all, but structurally it kind of deflates the tension a little bit, because at the point, and I guess the thing is, you wouldn't really know this unless you knew how it was going to end, so I don't know that I would have had this problem had this been the cut that was released in the theater, the more I'm thinking about it. But I'll just explain what my personal experience was with it, because I knew the movie already. Rogue comes into the picture after Wolverine has already done everything that's important for Wolverine to do in the past for the future to wind up the way it is. You could make the argument that maybe you needed Wolverine there in that last big climactic action scene because he's like fighting Sentinels and stuff, and maybe that had to happen. But the big thing that he does that is most important is that he mind melds with Professor Xavier, and Professor X gets to talk to Patrick Stewart. McAvoy, Professor X gets to talk to Stewart, Professor X. That's the big important thing. Once that's happened, and he gets his mojo back, and he gets less insecure, and he knows how to use his powers again, you don't really need Wolverine anymore. Wolverine could snap back to the future, and I'm pretty sure he would wind up in exactly the future that he winds up in. And then maybe wouldn't have even ended up drowning and wouldn't have gotten picked up by a Mystique. I do think it's really interesting, I just thought of this, that it is kind of inadvertently, because of the Wolverine from the future, that past Wolverine ends up winding up in the waiting arms of Mystique. And also really fascinating because it's through one of, I guess I'm talking a lot longer than I planned on, excuse me, but just stuff's coming to me. And also through that classic scene where Magneto, because he's moving metal, takes Wolverine and throws him to a really far place. And Magneto and Mystique in the future were always working together. I think that's really interesting, that whole dynamic is what puts him in the arms of Mystique at the end of the movie, who will do something with him that might be some other version of Weapon X. It would be really interesting if it was something close to the actual comic book Weapon X, since Origins got so far away from that. I just cannot wait to see. I'm beating a dead horse, but I cannot wait to see what happens with all that stuff. Anyway, I digress. But I'm just not sure that you really need that stuff for the future to happen the way it ends up happening, except for, again, where Wolverine winds up at the end of it. So when they're going to spring Rogue and all that stuff, we've already got Professor X and Mystique and everyone moving headlong into what the final act is going to be. So that, I mean, that's really my only criticism of it. If you could have somehow put that scene a little bit earlier, it just the tension would have been higher, and it just would have been kind of cooler for our characters in the future to have more to do with more of them anyway, to have more to do with why the characters in the past ultimately get to where they need to be, so that we have a more peaceful future. That's all I'm saying. And I also, one thing I do really appreciate is that the dominoes start falling in the future a little bit more gradually, because in the theatrical cut, of course, would kill off a whole lot of the X-Men right at the end, and we're still doing that here. But there's something really weighty about the way Bobby gets killed, and I think it doesn't feel quite as rushed when all those other X-Men get killed at the end, when we have somebody so important to the overall narrative, and somebody who's been there since the beginning and who I like a lot, who gets killed in that self-sacrificial way earlier in the movie. So the more I'm talking about it, the more I really like this cut, and I'm really glad that I watched it. And I think that this would have, I had this upside down. Wow, and I think that this would have done just as well in the theater, and was wonderful. I see why certain things were cut, and it might be that subplot was cut for exactly what I'm talking about, for exactly the reason I'm talking about, or at least maybe partially cut because of that, because it kind of deflates the tension, and it's kind of unnecessary, ultimately. But I like it visually. I like that Patrick Stewart gets to be involved in another action scene. The plane stuff is really cool. Anyway, this is wonderful, and like I said, if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, I just spoiled everything for you, but you should watch it for yourself. And I'm really glad that they released this, and I wish we got more things like this. I've been saying that I'm of two minds sometimes about director's cuts, especially with the Marvel shared universe thing, because it's kind of weird to have a thing in the theater and then put out a director's cut that adds more scenes in, with this ongoing narrative that goes through all these different movies, and then you're not sure what counts and what doesn't as canon or whatever. But as long as the movies play fair with that, I'm starting, especially after seeing this, to think, you know what, forget continuity. I don't care. I wish that the deleted scenes in Age of Ultron would be added back in a director's cut, so that we could see what that would have been like with them, because that movie feels a little bit too rushed and should have been longer. I wish we had that with Amazing Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man 2. Just give us a cut that puts it all back in. Forget canon. Who cares? Maybe it's an interesting study, to see what should have been put back in, and maybe directors and studios will make better choices in the future of what to cut, what to leave in, and that sometimes a good movie requires a longer runtime if fans are watching these things and going, wow, this is a better cut, I sure wish you guys had left this stuff in, and then maybe that will affect folks' decisions in the future. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to me ramble on about this. Like I said, I had a few things I wanted to make sure that I said, and then as I was sitting here discussing it with myself, I thought of a whole bunch of other things that I hadn't really thought of before. So anyway, thanks for watching, sure appreciate it, and I'd love to know other people's opinions of this if you saw it, and like I said, if you haven't, and you love that movie, I would really, really recommend it. Thanks for watching. I'm Captain Logan, and this concludes today's Captain's Log.